I want to welcome you to Tales of Cape Cod. Now, I hope you had a very pleasant Memorial Day, and perhaps this program will help illustrate and underline what the holiday was all about. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, William Martin, I do want to make sure that I thank the sponsors, Diane and David Munsell. Are they here tonight? Well, thank you. And I want to thank Helen Farrer, who connected us with Mr. Martin. And I want to thank Titcomb's Bookstore for being here to help sell the books, and they're practically all gone. And whatever's left will be available during our reception. Our speaker tonight, besides being famous for being Jude Martin's cousin, so Jude, as you know, is our super duper dessert receptionist. So Mr. Martin is also well known as a best-selling author of such classics, Cape Cod, Back Bay, Harvard Yard, all three of those books I just loved. And I understand we may have some book club members here tonight that like to zoom in on William Martin's books. So if you're here, I hope you enjoy the presentation. So he's also the creator of a PBS documentary and a cult classic horror movie, which, you know, he'll have to tell you about that. So he's an award-winning author of at least 12 novels. In 2005, he was recipient of the prestigious New England Book Award given to the author whose, quote, body of work stands as a significant contribution to the culture of the region, unquote. In 2015, he won the Samuel Eliot Madison Award for, quote, patriotic pride, artful scholarship, and an eclectic interest in the sea and things maritime. In 2018, he received the Robert B. Parker Award. His newest book, December 1941, has been called a pedal-to-the-floor historical spy thriller. Ooh. Might have something to do with it. Might have something to do with that cult horror film. We don't know. But anyway, it takes the reader across the United States from Los Angeles to D.C. and it introduces the reader to the players of the times. FDR, Churchill, the Nazis of Southern California, and the readers of the script that became Casablanca. I am honored to introduce the king of historical thriller, William Martin.
Thank you. It is great to be back in front of a live audience, not Zoom. I had to put pants on and actual shoes, and to be able to talk to you tonight about December 41. Standing in this room, however, is an honor, and it immediately gets my imagination spinning, because I wonder if these walls could talk, what they would tell us about the court cases that appeared in this room, and about all of the debates that we could have heard in this room, and about the arguments over the American Revolution. And of course, right out in the little quadrangle or triangle out there stood the Liberty Pole that supposedly was cut down a few times by the loyalists in the town and then put back up by the rebels of the town. And according to Joseph Berger in his great book, Cape Cod Pilot, a book, by the way, that you all should read if you're interested in the history of the Cape. It's a WPA project study of the history of the Cape, 1935. And it just captures what this world was like then to a very sharp-eyed observer. In Cape Cod Pilot, he talks about the widow who lived here on the square, who threatened, because she was a loyalist, to cut down that Liberty pole sometime. And finally she did. And they tarred and feathered her and put her on a rail. There are some stories that happened right outside and right inside here that, of course, found their way into this book, which I suspect some of you have read. When I was a boy, a long time ago now, my family had a house in Manomet on the bluffs. And I would sit on the front lawn in an afternoon when I was 12, 13 years old, and I would let my eye and my imagination wander. I would look to the south, just toward the point around which the mouth of the canal appeared, and you could see the freighters going in and out. Moving to the east, you could see the sand dunes here of Sandy Neck, also called by the Indians Mosquetucket, the Great Salt Marsh. And then as your eye wandered toward the southeast, you could see in the distance the fog bank that always seemed to hang over Chatham. And if you were sitting there in the late afternoon and the sun was behind you and you looked across, the dunes of Provincetown leapt out at you like a three-dimensional figure that you could almost reach out and touch. It was only about 18 miles across. This was a wonderful place for daydreaming. I imagined the Pilgrims coming through. I speculated on the Vikings coming through. And I imagined the whalers and the fishermen and the rum runners and all the other characters who occupied Cape Cod Bay across a span of about 1,000 years. And about 20 years later, I thought to myself, well, I've written about Boston and I've written a couple of other novels. I think now I'm going to write that book about the Cape that has been percolating in my mind since I was a kid. And that's what's called The Buried Fossil. What I'm doing here for you is taking you into the creative process. Where do you get your ideas from is perhaps the most commonly asked question of any writer. And the most honest answer is, I don't know. But then you start analyzing a little bit, and you will come up with various places that you find ideas that will lead you on what, for me, are very long hunts into the past and into the library stacks and into the locations that I have to visit in order to bring them to life for you. And one of the ways that this happens is that idea that you got when you were a kid, and it's still in your head, and somehow or another you pull it out. That's the buried fossil. There's also the great first line. I once came up with a novel because I was stumped, and I sat there and I started writing different opening lines. I wrote one that sounded rather familiar. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I tried another one saying, call me Ishmael. And then I thought, who would ever name a character Ishmael in a book? And then I wrote the line, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. The opening lines of confession in the Catholic faith. And I said, oh, this prompts an answer. And the answer was, how long has it been since your last confession? And the response is, in this particular scene, and it all just came to life in front of me, 6 weeks and 3 days. And the priest almost falls out of the confessional because he knows that now an Irish rebel has shown up in his confessional in the south end of Boston in 1916, and he's come to collect weapons for the Irish Rebellion. And a whole novel came to life for me, right there off of a really good opening line. I once got an idea from a bumper sticker. I was driving along, not certain of what my second novel would be, and I saw in front of me a bumper sticker that said, "Bequeath thy kidneys." And, you know, I might be a storyteller, but I don't lie. And you guys sound like you think I'm not telling the truth here. But it said, "Bequeath thy kidneys." And I said to my wife, who's sitting over there, Chris, what would happen if somebody got an organ transplant and became fascinated by the donor, became involved in the donor's life, and found himself at the end of the novel in exactly the same place that the donor was at the beginning of the novel? And out of that came a book called Nerve Endings, which made the New York Times bestseller list and came very close to being a feature film back in the 1980s. So ideas come from many different places. The idea for December 41 had its moment of conception in a crowded movie theater in January of, I think, 4 years ago, when we were watching the movie Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill in May of 1940. The Nazis are on the move. They are driving the British troops toward Dunkirk. France is about to fall, and England is about to stand alone. And there's a scene about halfway through the movie where Winston Churchill goes onto a secure phone in the basement of his headquarters, all alone, and calls Franklin Roosevelt and begs Roosevelt to help him, to send him weapons, to send him money, to perhaps even send troops. FDR, of course, can't help him. His hands are tied by the vagaries and the struggles of American politics that he's involved with. And so he just says no. And the camera cuts to a shot of Winston Churchill defeated, sitting alone in this dark basement with his head down, the phone on his lap. What is he going to do? And as I was watching that in the movie theater, I thought to myself, in a year and a half, those two men will meet in the White House right after Pearl Harbor. And they will begin an alliance that will carry England and the United States and the Soviet Union to victory over fascism in the next 4 years. And I thought to myself, at Christmas, they will actually stand together on the south portico of the White House and light the national Christmas tree. And then the next idea popped into my head while the movie is unrolling, and what a target they would make. That's how ideas sometimes come to life. Somebody's going to try to shoot them both that night. Now, I had to persuade myself that we know it didn't happen, but could it have happened? Anytime you're writing historical fiction, you're asking a reader to believe the world that you're going to take them into. And when you take them into a world in which you know and we know that FDR and Churchill both survived, and you also know, if you've read any of my books, that I'm not one of those novelists who will write a historical fiction in which I will change history. History is going to unfold in tandem with the lives of the characters. Well, you know that FDR and Churchill are not going to die at the end of this, but somebody is. And you also know that I'm going to make this as believable as possible. So I went looking for books by Secret Service agents about this event and about those first weeks after Pearl Harbor. And I came across a book called Riley of the White House by Mike Riley. He was Franklin Roosevelt's director of Secret Service and security in the White House. He ascended to that job the day after Pearl Harbor. He was also what was known as FDR's elbow man. He was at the president's elbow during every event and every potentially dangerous situation, because Franklin Roosevelt, of course, could not move because of the polio, and there might be a moment when he had to move very quickly, and Mike Riley was built like a fullback, and he could pick the president up and run with him if he had to. And Riley talks about the various concerns in that first week after Pearl Harbor. They actually feared that the Germans would find a way to send a paramilitary unit into Washington, maybe even parachute them, in order to kidnap the president. This was a concern. There were machine guns immediately placed on the roof of the White House after Pearl Harbor. There were all kinds of other security measures as well, which I may get into in a moment. But Mike Riley wasn't worried about that. He thought that was a little absurd. What Mike Riley worried about was the possibility of a lone assassin, or perhaps a team of assassins dispatched to kill Franklin Roosevelt. And once I knew that this was a concern and the Secret Service was attempting to take steps to stop this kind of thing, I knew that I could write this novel. So I get started. Well, when am I going to finish a book like this, begin a book like this? Well, December 8th, 1941 sounds pretty good. Think of the things that are happening on December 8th, 1941. We're on the other side of the international date line. It's 2 a.m. in Tokyo, and the Japanese foreign minister comes from the palace of the emperor, having just told the emperor that in 90 minutes the attack will begin. In 30 minutes, our ambassadors in Washington will deliver this sheet of paper suspending all negotiations with the United States. He walks out at 2 a.m. and looks across the courtyard of the emperor's castle and realizes that the world is about to change. The camera of my imagination travels across the vast and empty canvas of Asian Russia, might pick up a train speeding from Siberia toward the front where the Germans and the Russians are in a death struggle outside of Moscow, and then it will land in a place in East Prussia called the Wolfschanz, Adolf Hitler's headquarters. Hitler, of course, and everyone in the Wolfschanz are feeling rather unhappy on the night of December 7th because the Russians have counterattacked 2 days before and stopped the German advance on Moscow just 12 miles from Red Square. And they are finally throwing the Germans back in what is the most cataclysmic extended battle perhaps in human history, the struggle between the Germans and the Russians between 1941 and 1945. When Hitler, on the night of December 7th, gets the news that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor, he becomes exultant. He was already getting a little delusional, perhaps. He becomes exultant, and he says, now we cannot lose because now we have an ally who has not been defeated in 3,000 years. He then orders Goebbels to convene the Reichstag for a meeting, and he is headed to Berlin. What is he going to do? The world wonders. Then, of course, we travel to London, where Winston Churchill, on the night of December 7th, is at Chequers, his country retreat. And he's in the middle of telling some extended story at the dinner table when a butler tries to get his attention. Yes, I'll talk to you in a minute. Let me finish this punchline. And he continues with the story, and the butler tries to get his attention and finally comes over to him and whispers in his ear that the American fleet has been attacked at Pearl Harbor. Churchill immediately leaps up, runs upstairs, grabs the telephone, calls FDR, and Roosevelt says, yes, it's all true. We are all in the same boat now. And as Winston Churchill would write later, he went to bed contemplating the vast economic and industrial power of the United States and he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. And so on the morning of December 8th, he arises and heads to London to immediately ask Parliament for a declaration of war against the Japanese. But the Japanese have beaten him to it. They've declared war on him. The camera of my imagination travels to Washington, D.C. And here, it's a misty morning, December 8th. We pick up Franklin Roosevelt in his bedroom. He's working on his speech, perhaps the most important speech he will ever give. He's sitting in his office or in his bed, and it's about 8 o'clock in the morning. His butler, Alonzo Fields, comes in with morning clothes. He's going to wear a swallow-tailed coat and striped trousers for the event at noontime that day. And FDR is editing. And FDR makes that morning one of the most famous edits in human history. He crosses out the word world history and inserts a word that you all know, infamy. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history, doesn't have anywhere near the oomph of a date which will live in infamy. He then, about 11:30, is wheeled down to his limousine. A limousine, by the way, that had actually belonged to Al Capone at some point. It was heavily armored, and that's why the Secret Service was using it. They were waiting for another custom-built presidential limousine from Ford, so they were using the old Al Capone limo. And they drove him down Pennsylvania Avenue after having made sure that every manhole cover was secure and that there was a soldier standing on Pennsylvania Avenue every 4 feet. It was the largest and most intense display of security that had ever been seen, in Washington, D.C. since Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural, when secession was underway and nobody knew what was about to happen in Washington. FDR was driven into a special entrance in the Capitol where he was lifted from the back seat of the car into his wheelchair. Many people in the United States knew that he had polio, but a large proportion of the American population had never seen him except standing on his feet. He never appeared in public except upright. So he was wheeled through the corridors of the White House, of the Capitol, taken up to the room where the Speaker of the House awaited him. He greeted many of the dignitaries, Republicans and Democrats, who would, in just a moment, form an honor guard when the president would walk up to the podium. Let me just read a little bit of the beginning of the book. That's where the book begins. All of the rest of that is background. All of the rest of that is what I have to learn and study and understand in order to get to the point where I can give you the drama. It was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world, now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening for the warm baritone and patrician inflections that somehow never sounded too upper crusty coming from the radio. Because America had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone. War encircling the earth. War once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. In Washington, the CBS radio announcer was describing the packed House chamber, the tense atmosphere, when suddenly his voice rose. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the president is appearing and moving toward the podium. And from out of deep bass consoles and tinny tabletop radios in every corner of the country, a roar exploded. Something between a cheer and an angry shout. The harsh, hard, ferocious cry of Americans lifting themselves from shock and drawing strength from the president, who'd lifted himself from a wheelchair and by a remarkable force of will was appearing upright before them. When the roar receded, the speaker announced, "Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor to present the President of the United States." More cheers and shouts. Then Franklin Roosevelt's voice rang out, firm, confident, indignant. "Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." In the far west, radio stations had gone off the air the night before so that Japanese bombers couldn't home in on the broadcasts. But now Roosevelt's voice rolled across deserts, up and over mountain ranges, and down into the warm green dream of Southern California. Down along boulevards laid like gridwork atop lettuce fields and orange groves. Down onto long, straight, relentless thoroughfares that ended where scrub-covered hillsides leapt up to define and divide the expanse of Los Angeles. Down into offices and coffee shops and cars where people were listening, unaware that as Roosevelt spoke, a Nazi assassin was shooting at targets in a local canyon and planning the most daring act of the age. Unaware also that before it was over, he would draw many of them into his dark orbit. That's the opening passage. Well, thank you. Thank you. But why did I want to go to Los Angeles? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, when I do research, I dig back into my brain and come up with little tidbits of interesting information that I've always read about. And I had once read about a compound in Los Angeles. It's called the Murphy Ranch. It's not really a ranch, and there was no Murphy. It was a 55-acre plot that fascists and fascist sympathizers in the 1930s bought from the estate of cowboy comedian Will Rogers. Directly opposite, not that he was involved, I think he was dead by the time they bought it, directly across from the entrance to the Riviera Country Club on Sunset Boulevard, you can drive up a road, up past beautiful homes, up to the top of a hill. Los Angeles is the kind of place where even the most beautiful street can end in a scrub-covered hillside. And then there's a fire road that goes back into a canyon. And you can travel along that fire road, even today, to a chain-link fence. On the other side of that chain-link fence, about 300 feet down in the scrub pines and bay bushes and all of the other kinds of shrubbery down there, you will see a long concrete stairway. You will see water tanks, fuel tanks, a powerhouse. And if you walk all the way down, you'll see the remnants of terraced gardens and things like that. Down in this canyon, in the Murphy Ranch, the fascists would gather and they would target practice. They would prepare for Der Tag, Der Tag, of course, was the day when they would all rise up and take control of the American government and welcome Hitler into California in a parade down Hollywood Boulevard. They had even authorized a famous Los Angeles architect, who turned out to be black, by the way, a man named Paul Williams, which is rather ironic considering their intent and their alliance with the Ku Klux Klan, among others, a famous Los Angeles architect to build a 40-room mansion, the plans of which you can find at the UCLA Library, a 40-room mansion that was to have been Hitler's Western White House. These people were absolutely bonkers, but they were very dangerous. And when I read this story in a magazine, I put it into my head and I said, someday I'm going to use these guys. Someday I'm going to use that location. It'll just be fun to go and visit it, which of course we did the next time we went out to visit our son. So as the book opens, it's December 8th, and the FBI is rounding up the usual suspects. And a lot of unusual suspects. Some of them have been dispatched to round up Japanese whose names have been on the FBI lists, and others are going to round up the Germans, even though the Germans have yet to declare war on the United States. Don't forget, FDR has just declared war on Japan, but the Germans are sitting quietly, and the Americans aren't quite sure if the Germans are going to declare war on them. The German General Staff doesn't want to declare war on the United States because they haven't even planned for war with the United States. But FDR, in his quiet way, knows that we will have to defeat Germany before we defeat Japan. And that will be what he and Churchill will eventually conclude in their meeting that is coming up. The FBI goes down into that canyon and they raid it. They arrest members of the German-American Bund. They arrest members of the Silver Shirt League, a group of about 15,000 men who marched around Southern California and some of the southern states in silver shirts and blue jodhpur pants and neckties and Sam Brown belts, and they had an L over their chest for loyalty. One of them actually ran for president, a raging anti-Semite named William Dudley Peterson in 1936, and he only got about 5,000 votes. So the Silver Shirt League is involved, and the Ku Klux Klan, and the members of the Bund. And the FBI arrests a bunch of these guys, but one of them gets away. And he's the one they should have caught, because he's the one whose job it is, and the job he's been training for, to get himself to Washington, D.C., and shoot Franklin Roosevelt on the night that he lights the national Christmas tree. That's the plot. And the opportunity to explore Los Angeles and to explore fascist groups like that were very prominent in the 1930s, organized themselves, and were prepared to do a lot of damage. That gives me a wonderful place to jump off from in a novel. The German-American Bund in Los Angeles operated pretty much without the oversight of the FBI. The FBI was more worried about the communists in Southern California because J. Edgar Hoover hated communists, and he didn't care quite as much about the Japanese or about the Germans. And if you go to Los Angeles today, you won't find the Bund Hall, but if you watch a basketball game in which the Lakers are playing, you'll basically be looking at the ground upon which the Bund Hall existed on Figueroa and 15th. Staples Center is to be found in that spot. And they had the hall, they had a bookstore, the Aryan bookstore. They had a restaurant called the Gaststube, where you could get sauerbraten and other German delicacies. And in the auditorium, and there are photographs of all of this, They would celebrate Hitler's birthday every year with big photographs of the Fuhrer and marching bands and all of the rest of it. The opportunity to bring all of this to life for you, to show you what was going on, even in Tinseltown, is one that gives me a great excitement when I sit down to write this book. But there are other reasons to want to write about Los Angeles on December 8th. One of them is, of course, the fact that on the day of December 8th, 1941, a script arrived at Warner Brothers. It was a script to a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. Anybody know what that movie was eventually going to become? Casablanca. It truly arrived that day and was assigned to a young would-be writer for coverage. That is to say, this young guy would write the report. I decided, and he very soon after that disappears from history. And I thought to myself, I'm going to make that guy one of my main characters. And he also works, he's from Boston, he went out there because he wanted to get into the movie business, and the best he's been able to do is get a job as a reader for $1.12 an hour. That's all they were making. And he's also been recruited into something called the Los Angeles Jewish Community Committee. This committee was organized by a Jewish war veteran who saw how dangerous these Nazis and Nazi sympathizers were becoming in the United States in the 1930s. And so he recruited people, mostly Gentiles, to infiltrate the Bund. And they uncovered some pretty amazing stuff that these people were talking about behind closed doors, these so-called, German patriots who claimed to be American patriots. One idea that they hatched that was eventually nipped in the bud was to entice American war veterans from World War I, disaffected war veterans of the sort who had been in the bonus marches, to attack armories up and down the West Coast, steal all of the weapons, distribute them, and begin the uprising. Another plan that they came up with was to run gas into the giant Shrine Auditorium down by USC on a night in 1933 when the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, which included people like the famous movie director John Ford, were to have a great meeting. Then there was another suggestion that they kidnap Louis B. Mayer, Harry Cohn, Jack L. Warner, all of the Jewish movie executives on their way to work on the same day, and take them all up to a park in a place called La Cañada and hang them all. These plans were actually discussed and were revealed by the Los Angeles Jewish Community Committee. So all of this stuff was going on, and this is all background to the book. But why else would I want to include the movie Casablanca in a book like this? Well, there's a great line. You probably remember it if you love the movie. When Bogart, sitting alone after he's met Ingrid Bergman again after all these years, is sitting in the dark shadows, and Sam is in the background tinkling at the piano. And Bogart says, "Sam, it's December 1941 in Casablanca. What time is it in New York?" "I don't know, sir. I don't have my watch." "I bet they're asleep in New York. I bet they're asleep all over America." And what I want to show you is an America that's been asleep, that's been in love with its movies and its music and its big bands and its entertainments and its radio shows, all of which get referred to on a regular basis in this book. An America that has been asleep but is about to awaken. An America that has been listening to Lindbergh as he organized a group called America First, to keep America out of the war and out of the world, a group whose membership would be about 800,000 at its peak, and include people such as Joseph P. Kennedy and his son John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Gerald Ford and a lot of other people. And all of that background is going to feed into the book. And the story of the making of Casablanca is going to travel along with the scenes in Los Angeles at the very beginning. Because on the day that the script for Casablanca, the report was handed in to Hal Wallis, a man who later had a big impact on my career. Hal Wallis, the famous producer of Casablanca, was called an exciting melodrama with excellent atmosphere. On the day that was handed in, December 11th, it was a Thursday, 1941, Adolf Hitler had traveled to the Kroll Opera House to stand in front of 2,000 Sieg-heiling Nazis and look out at them and spend a half an hour berating the man in the wheelchair who, while our soldiers are fighting in snow and ice, likes to make his chats from the fireside. That man who is the main culprit in this war. Hitler, of course, is talking about FDR, and he is about to declare war on the United States, shocking half the world and making Roosevelt thank him quietly. Perhaps Roosevelt never spoke it loudly, but thanking Hitler for declaring war on the United States. And Churchill loved it too. Churchill insisted that he come to the United States and meet with FDR. Got on one of the British battleships to travel across the Atlantic, what he called, in a letter to his wife, the worst week of the war he spent, because he spent the whole time dosing himself on Mother Sill's seasick remedies, grousing about the fact that he couldn't communicate properly back with London. They developed various means by which they could maintain radio silence and at the same time continue to pass messages back and forth. He didn't want to fly because he didn't like to fly, but also because a plane that traveled to Washington in those days from England would have to stop in the maritime provinces where he might be fogged in for a week up in Nova Scotia or someplace like that. So he chose to travel aboard the battleship. FDR at first didn't want him to come because FDR knew that he was going to try to persuade FDR to turn on Germany first. And FDR didn't want to be forced into that. He was playing the waiting game with Hitler. Churchill is dynamic, forceful, forward-moving. FDR is craftier and smarter and a little bit more close to the vest in just about everything that he does. But in time, Churchill will get to Washington. He will insist that he travel from Norfolk by plane to Washington, because the original plan was that the battleship would come all the way up the Chesapeake as far as it could, and then he'd come in a small boat the rest of the way. There's a great scene in the biography by Alonzo Fields of Monday morning, December 22nd, December 21st, when he walks by the White House and the presidential bedroom, and hears Eleanor, fresh back from New York, yelling at Franklin, "What do you mean, 20 guests for an indefinite stay?" "Well, it was top secret. I couldn't really tell you, Eleanor." "Ah, Fields, come in here." And FDR then informs Fields that night they will have Winston Churchill as a house guest. FDR dispatches an airplane to get Churchill. They fly back up, and it's one of the most amazing passages you will read in the biography of Lord Moran, Churchill's doctor, who is on that small plane with Churchill, along with Tommy Thompson, his bodyguard, and Lord Beaverbrook. And don't forget, they have been for almost 2 years under blackout. And they travel from Norfolk, Virginia, up the Chesapeake toward Washington. And for the first time, they see, looking out on both sides of them, a country that is still lit up as dusk comes on. The United States would eventually observe blackouts, which would begin very soon thereafter. But they see a society that is still alive, that still has a future. And they are all but brought to tears by the fact that they have this powerful country as an ally. That evening, and this had to be an amazingly galvanizing moment for the United States and for Britain, the White House press secretary, Joseph Early, reads an announcement, which is astonishingly bland for such an amazing event. Gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Mr. Churchill, is now with Mr. Roosevelt in the White House. He arrived by air, and the President met him at an airport near Washington. With him are Lord Beaverbrook and a technical staff. He promised a longer statement to follow, along with a picture that would go out on the AP wire photo within the hour. He authorized the press to release this information as of 6:58 p.m. Eastern Time to all news outlets. The next morning, it will appear on the front page of all the newspapers in America. Churchill, FDR, and FDR's bodyguard or servant, Captain Beardsall, who would hold him up when he stood up. And they're standing on the front lawn of the White House. Across Lafayette Park, in my novel, a German assassin who has been chased from Los Angeles across the United States on the Super Chief and has made it to Washington. Yes, he does make it. This wouldn't be a novel with a Zowie finish unless he got there to Washington. He opens the newspaper and he sees this picture and he is amazed. He says, "Now I can get them both." And that's what he's going to try to do, he and the two people who are helping him. But there are people after him, an FBI agent, the FBI agent who picked up an odd shell casing back there in the canyon in Los Angeles. That young guy who wrote the report on Casablanca and has somehow become a suspect in all of this himself and has to clear his name. And a young actress who has taken on the role of the wife of this German assassin, not quite knowing who he is, but liking him nevertheless. And it will be my job to keep you turning pages and finding out what the fates of each of these characters is to be. That's how historical fiction works. That's how it works when you read a book like Cape Cod, where I tell you the story of the pilgrims, and I create fictional pilgrims who will represent the real pilgrims that I have read about and whose lives I have absorbed. And that is how it works in a book like this, where you know that FDR and Churchill won't die. But if I'm doing my job right, there will come a moment when you are reading this book when you will forget that that's the way it turned out. And you will be saying, "Oh my God, I hope he doesn't kill Churchill." because Churchill is about to give us a magnificent Christmas Eve speech in which, after the president has lit the tree, and by the way, there is an astonishing piece of video news footage that you can see on YouTube from the British Pathé News Service. The camera is right here. FDR is here. Churchill is behind him. The assassin is somewhere out there on Constitution Ave. And now, for the 9th time, I light the National Community Christmas Tree. FDR gives a speech, and he looks around at Churchill, and they're as close to the camera as I am to this microphone. And he says, "Now, do you want to speak?" And Churchill gets up and gives a speech which he has written the night before, in which he concludes with this: "Here in the midst of war, raging and roaring over all the lands and seas, creeping nearer to our hearts and homes, here amid all the tumult, we have tonight the peace of the Spirit in each cottage home and in every generous heart. Therefore, we may cast aside, for this night at least, the cares and dangers which beset us, and make for the children an evening of happiness in a world of storm. Here then, for one night only, each home throughout the English-speaking world should be a brightly lighted island of happiness and peace. It is an aspiration that vibrated through the world in 1941, and given the events that we experience here in the early 21st century, it has vibrated through our world as well. Churchill was one of the great rhetoricians of his time. As it was said of him at one point in his famous "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech, he has taken the English language and used it as a weapon. Well, here he uses it as a salve on Christmas Eve. And it would be a terrible loss if that goddamn Nazi got to shoot him before he gave this speech. So you're going to have to read the book to find out if that happens. You've traveled with me before into the past. You've seen the evolution of this magnificent peninsula of land through my eyes and through the eyes of my characters, an evolution that continues to this very day. If there is any book I would love to write again, just to have the experience of writing it and being back in that world, I would say probably be Cape Cod. But I don't think I could, I honestly don't think I could improve upon that book. And by the way, there's only one copy left of it. So I hope that you will all be inspired by this evening to join me in this suspense-filled novel. Cape Cod covers 1,000 years. It begins with a whale stranding in 1000 AD. It introduces the Vikings. Yes, there could have been Vikings on Cape Cod. I can remember talking with Fred Dunford at the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History way back when. He says, you know, we haven't really found any evidence that the Vikings were here, but that doesn't mean there isn't any. And that evidence in the book is an axe. Some of you may remember. You have traveled with me across 1,000 years of time. Now travel with me on an intense journey from Los Angeles to Maine, or to Los Angeles to Washington. That's another book. From Los Angeles, that was Nerve Endings. That was my second book. From Los Angeles to Washington, travel with me. It only takes 2.5 weeks. The book is shorter. You will be satisfied, and you will be on the beach holding the book like this, saying, oh, wow, oh. And when you are done, all your friends on the beach will want to read the book too. Thank you all. Now, we have a few minutes for questions, maybe a question or two, and then my cousin Judy she's in there already. She's working on the desserts. So, any questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm working on a couple of ideas. I'm not quite sure what it'll be yet, so I'm going to withhold comment until the comment is more specific. But for now, you have December 41, so enjoy it. And thank you all for coming. And down here, yes, sir.
Thank you. It strikes me that the amount of research you do on these the history would equally be applied to writing actual natural history instead of historical fiction. Why did you choose to do fiction?
I don't have to footnote. And there's more money in fiction. Or at least there has been for me. I've thought about writing historical, actual straight-up history, and you know, you need to just find that right idea that will propel you into an area where there will be lots of readers that are interested in what you're writing about. And you know, I just never came up with that idea. And I also find that it's kind of fun what I do. And while at the age that I am now, I don't find writing any easier than it was when I was in my 20s, when Back Bay came out. I find that I am getting better at it, and the writing of fiction is something that can keep you going for a long period of time. There is well, I remember my kids, when they tried to figure out what it was that I do for a living, they were sitting in the backyard with a couple of their little friends once. Kids were maybe 5 and 6 years old, and one little girl said, well, you know, my mommy's a doctor, and she goes to the hospital every day and makes everyone better. The little boy said, my daddy's a lawyer, and he goes to court every day and puts away bad guys and makes us all safe. And my son said, my daddy's a writer. He goes up in the attic every day and makes stuff up. And it's easier than footnoting to make stuff up. And by the way, most of what I've told you about Churchill and FDR isn't in the book. It's the base of the iceberg, and the narrative, the suspense-filled pursuit across America, is the tip of that iceberg. But I need to know all of that stuff, so that when Churchill and FDR come on the stage at the end of the book, and you do see them, and you do look in their eyes, you know that I know them pretty well, and have had a pretty close relationship with them in the writing of this book. And this was really a satisfying experience, totally different for me. The main character, Peter Fallon, who's appeared in my last 6 novels, isn't in this book, but I think that for the things that are different in this book, you'll find a lot of the things that I hope you expect from me, starting with a really good story that moves along very quickly. And I think now we should move along very quickly to those desserts. Thank you.